The summer of 1905 in Missouri was a suffocating blanket of heat and silence, but for Elias Thorne, the real weight was the gloom of the inherited past. He stood on the cracked slate porch of the Lincoln family manor, a sprawling Victorian Gothic structure that seemed to sag under its own history. The manor sat miles outside of St. Joseph, surrounded by fields of dying corn and a wood so dense it seemed to drink the light. Elias, a meticulous architect from New York, had traveled west to settle the estate of his recently deceased great-aunt Clara Lincoln. He hadn't seen her since childhood, but the terms of the will were clear. He was the sole heir, with one peculiar and binding condition: he had to live in the house for at least 1 year. He pushed open the heavy oak front door. The air inside was thick and stale, smelling of dust, dried lavender, and something metallic, like old blood or rusted iron. Sunlight struggled through the tall, grime-caked windows, illuminating motes of dancing dust that seemed to mock the stillness. The first room he entered was the grand parlor, its furniture draped in white sheets like a gallery of pale ghosts. In the center of the far wall, dominating the space, was the object of both his mild curiosity and the manor's infamous local legend, the Lincoln family mirror. It was a monstrous piece, nearly 8 feet tall, framed in heavy blackened walnut carved with swirling, aggressive tendrils that looked less like decorative foliage and more like frozen, grasping hands. The glass itself was murky, old, and distorted, catching the meager light in a way that made the room look perpetually deeper and darker than it was. Elias knew the stories. They were the kind of morbid folklore whispered by local Missouri children. The mirror didn't just reflect the present, it showed the future, specifically the face of the next person in the Lincoln family line who was destined to die. The dead always appeared in its reflection first. He dismissed the tale with a weary sigh. Elias was a man of blueprints, mathematics, and logic. Superstition was a flaw in the design. Yet, as he approached the mirror, a chill that had nothing to do with the outside heat crept up his spine. He raised a hand, intending to wipe the dust from the glass, but hesitated. He felt a sudden, profound reluctance, a primitive warning from a place his reason couldn't touch. "It's just glass and wood, Elias," he muttered, trying to reassure the trembling in his own hand. He finally reached out, brushing away a layer of dust near the center. His own reflection, tired and severe, snapped into sharp view. He looked fine, perfectly solid, slightly stressed. Nothing spectral. As he turned to leave the parlor and inspect the rest of the house, his gaze accidentally swept back to the mirror. For a fleeting, heart-stopping instant, his reflection was not alone. Standing just over his right shoulder, clearly visible in the murky glass, was a figure. It was a woman, indistinct and hazy, but with eyes that seemed to burn through the gloom. Her clothes were antiquated, faded brown and gray, and her face was a mask of gaunt sorrow. Elias spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The parlor was empty. The white-sheeted furniture stood precisely where it had been. He was entirely alone. He stared back at the mirror. Now it only showed him and the room behind him. He walked slowly back to the glass, his breath catching in his throat. Had the long journey and the oppressive atmosphere of the old house played a trick on his mind? Exhaustion, he concluded, was a powerful hallucinogen. He spent the next hour dragging his luggage upstairs to the master bedroom, which was mercifully less shadowed than the ground floor. As he unpacked a leather-bound notebook and a few tools for measuring the house's structural integrity, a necessary formality for his architectural training, he tried to regain his composure. He needed to be rational. He was here to catalog, assess, and eventually sell this burden of brick and memory. Later that evening, the oppressive silence of the manor began to morph into something else, a series of soft, unidentifiable noises. The house was settling, of course, old wood creaks, pipes groan. But these were different. They were faint, rhythmic scrapes from the floor directly below the master bedroom. The parlor. Elias grabbed a heavy brass candlestick, a foolish weapon, but one that gave him a small, false sense of security. He crept down the grand staircase, his shadow stretching and twisting on the walls in the dim light of the single oil lamp he carried. He reached the parlor doorway and held his breath. The scraping sound had stopped. The metallic scent, stronger now, hit him. He pushed the door open. Everything seemed the same. The white sheets, the darkness, the formidable mirror on the far wall. Then he noticed the floor, right in front of the mirror. The layer of dust, which had been undisturbed moments ago, was now gone in a small, distinct arc. It was as if something heavy had been slowly dragged in a semicircle right where the reflection of the spectral woman had appeared. Elias approached the freshly disturbed spot, holding the lamp high. He knelt down, running his fingers over the exposed wood. It was rough, scored with long, shallow grooves that were too precise to be random wear. He stood up, his gaze drawn once more to the huge, menacing mirror. This time, he didn't look at his own reflection. He looked at the shadows reflected in the deep corners of the room behind him. And this time, the reflection was subtly yet irrevocably different. In the corner near the fireplace, one of the white sheets draped over a large armchair seemed to have shifted. The drape had pulled tighter, revealing the stark outline of a human head and shoulders pressing up against the fabric. Elias took a deep, shuddering breath. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't a trick of the light. The silence of the manor felt like a physical presence pressing against his eardrums. He knew, with the cold certainty that bypassed logic, that he was not alone. Someone, or something, was in the room, hiding beneath the sheet, watching him through the very glass that allegedly showed the dead. He could feel the crushing weight of the family curse settling upon him, not as a mystical warning, but as a very real, very human danger. He raised the brass candlestick slightly, his knuckles white. "Who's there?" His voice was a ragged whisper that sounded impossibly loud in the dead air of the parlor. No answer, only the heavy, silent weight of the sheeted figure. "If you've made it this far, you're trapped in the mystery now. Don't let Elias face this alone. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss Chapter 2, where we dig deeper into the secrets hidden behind the Lincoln mirror. Elias's training as an architect demanded certainty, quantifiable space, and verifiable structure. This moment, the bulge beneath the sheet, the silence, the sheer weight of the implied threat, was a violation of all those principles. He took 3 deliberate, slow steps back, forcing the heat of fear into the cold calculus of his mind. If someone was under that sheet, they had to be a trespasser. St. Joseph was far enough away, and the house was isolated. But the scrapes on the floor, the disturbed dust in front of the mirror, suggested a motivation beyond simple theft. "I know you're there," Elias called out, his voice louder this time, though still strained. "I have alerted the local sheriff to my arrival, and they are due for a welfare check tomorrow morning. Leave now, and there will be no trouble." The sheeted figure remained motionless. It was a bluff. He hadn't spoken to the sheriff. He watched his reflection in the mirror, searching for any movement from the figure behind him, a flicker of fabric, a widening of the shadow. Nothing. The reflection was stubbornly still, yet the sense of being intensely observed was palpable. Elias's eyes flickered to the mirror's frame. He noticed something he hadn't seen before in his initial shock. Tiny, almost imperceptible vertical lines running along the carved walnut frame, perfectly parallel to the glass edge. They were too clean to be wood grain. They looked like the seams of an industrial fitting. A track. He took another step back, shifting his focus from the figure to the furniture itself. The armchair under the sheet was massive, a heavy Victorian relic. He circled around to the side of the room, keeping a wide arc between himself and the corner. When he reached the sheet-covered armchair, he quickly used the brass candlestick to hook the corner of the fabric and rip it back, The chair was empty. Elias froze, a wave of dizzying relief and crushing self-doubt washing over him. The fabric had been carefully draped, and then perhaps a low chair or footstool had been placed strategically beneath the head section, simulating a posture. The tension in the fabric he'd seen in the mirror's reflection had been the result of a subtle, staged arrangement. But who staged it? And why? He looked back at the mirror. The light from his lamp revealed a small, shallow indentation in the dust on the floor near the mirror's base, right next to the dragging marks. It was the mark of a heavy leather shoe heel, the kind worn by men who worked the land or the city docks. Not a ghost, but a human intruder. Elias realized the true horror. He wasn't facing a supernatural curse, but a calculated human deception. Someone had been in the house moments ago, disturbed the dust, tried to frighten him with a stage figure reflected in the mirror, and then quickly escaped. He ran to the front door, rattling the bolt. It was locked from the inside. He checked the parlor windows, all nailed shut from decades of disuse. The kitchen door leading to the rear porch was bolted. The intruder had either a key or an access point Elias didn't know about. He raced back to the mirror, the scraping marks, the shoe print, the staged sheet. This was no petty thief. This was a deliberate campaign of psychological intimidation. He grabbed the side of the heavy walnut frame and began running his hand along the decorative carving, searching for the seam he thought he'd seen. His fingers found a slight gap, and with a grunt of effort, he pushed. The mirror, surprisingly, didn't move. He pushed harder, tracing the line with a pocket knife. The frame, he realized, wasn't just decorative. It was hinged. The carving at the top was a handle. He pulled. With a sound like the grinding of old bone, the massive mirror and its heavy frame swung inward like a door, revealing a black, narrow gap in the wall behind it. It was a cleverly concealed passageway, a hidden architectural feature that explained everything. The scraper on the floor, the staged scene, the rapid disappearance. The mirror wasn't cursed. It was a door. Elias peered into the gap. The air that rushed out was cold, damp, and smelled strongly of the metallic scent he'd noticed earlier, intensified by the stale air of a confined space. It wasn't blood. It was the smell of old iron and wet concrete. He had a choice: retreat and call the authorities, a sensible modern course of action, or pursue the human answer to the terrifying mystery. His architect's curiosity, now laced with a vengeful fear, drove him forward. He squeezed into the passage, his lamp illuminating a narrow, dust-choked service corridor barely wider than his shoulders. The walls were rough brick, and the floor was dirt. The passageway descended gently, suggesting it led to a basement or a sub-level. After 20 yards, the passage opened into a small, windowless storage room. It was dusty, but not abandoned. A small, roughly made wooden table held a half-burned paraffin lamp, a length of coarse rope, and a single dog-eared photograph. Elias picked up the photograph. It was old, yellowed, and heavily creased. It showed two people, a severe-looking man in a stiff suit, and a woman who looked strikingly like the spectral figure he had seen reflected in the mirror. He recognized the woman as his great-aunt Clara's sister, Agnes Lincoln, who had died years ago in a carriage accident according to family history. But the man was a stranger, with a cold, intense gaze. As Elias turned the photo over, the back held a single scrawled date, September 27th, 1888. Then he saw the real clue. Stacked neatly in a dark corner were 5 or 6 empty cans of black paint. Beside them lay a pile of crumpled cloths, stained with the same dark pigment. The metallic smell, iron, was the lingering residue of cheap industrial black paint. The woman in the mirror had not been a ghost. She had been a reflection of a painting on the backside of a piece of cleverly hinged cardboard, slipped into the room through the passage and positioned to be reflected in the grime-coated glass as Elias first approached. Someone had painstakingly created the illusion of the dead woman to reinforce the manor's legend and, crucially, to scare away the new heir. He was being driven out by an elaborate human plot. The question was not what was behind the mirror, but who and why they were so desperate to keep him from the manor. Elias pocketed the photograph and the paint-stained cloth. He had just uncovered the first layer of a cold, calculated crime, masked by the comforting veil of folklore. He would not be driven out. He would find the architect of this psychological terror. Elias quickly retreated from the hidden room, closing the mirror behind him with a decisive, dull thud. The massive walnut frame locked back into place, sealing the secret passage. He now understood the terrifying advantage of his antagonist, the ability to observe, stage, and disappear entirely, making Elias question his own sanity in a house he was legally bound to occupy. He returned upstairs, his architect's mind now racing with possibilities. The black paint cans suggested a deliberate campaign of disguise. Not just the illusion in the mirror, but perhaps the entire house had been manipulated. Why was the parlor so uniformly dark and dusty? To allow the reflection trick to work. Why the strong metallic smell? To cover up the smell of stale paint or something worse. He examined the photograph of Agnes Lincoln and the strange man again under the lamplight. The man had a peculiar, almost feral look, but his clothes were decent, suggesting a professional or landowner, not a vagrant. Elias resolved to visit the nearest town, St. Joseph, tomorrow, under the pretense of finding supplies. He needed to find out who this man was, and how he connected to the Lincoln family in 1888. The next morning, the heat had broken into a dull, relentless drizzle. Elias drove his hired buggy into St. Joseph. The town was bustling with the controlled energy of a thriving Midwestern hub, a stark contrast to the deathly silence of the manor. At the St. Joseph County Archives, a kind, elderly clerk named Mrs. Peterson assisted him. He claimed to be researching his family's history for an inheritance portfolio. He presented the photograph, focusing on the man. Mrs. Peterson's face clouded with a flicker of recognition, but also distaste. "That, sir, is a face you do not forget. That is Silas Crane. He was a lawyer, a land speculator involved in the railway booms of the 80s and 90s, and a man with a reputation." "What sort of reputation?" Elias pressed. "For being acquisitive, ruthless. He had a great deal of interest in the land around the Lincoln Manor, specifically the water rights along the creek," she said, leaning closer and lowering her voice. "He was also known for his rather unorthodox business partnerships. They say he got his way through methods more forceful than legal. He disappeared quite suddenly in 1889. The dates clicked. Silas Crane was last active in 1888, the date on the back of the photograph. Agnes Lincoln died in a carriage accident after that time." Elias then inquired about Agnes Lincoln and her carriage accident. Mrs. Peterson checked a ledger of local obituaries. "Agnes Lincoln perished in a fire in the family's summer cottage in 1891, not a carriage accident, Mr. Thorne. It was a tragedy. She was the one they called the delicate one, not robust like her sister, your Aunt Clara. The fire was ruled accidental, a faulty lamp." The family history Elias knew was a lie. Agnes died in a fire 2 years after the photo was taken, not a carriage accident. And Silas Crane disappeared around the same time. The family's fabrication suggested a conscious effort to bury the truth about Agnes. Armed with this new information, Elias returned to the suffocating manor. The rain had intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm on the roof that seemed to heighten his anxiety. He needed to go back to the hidden room. He reopened the mirror door. This time, he brought a coil of rope and a sturdy pickaxe he'd purchased in town. He needed to find what Silas Crane was looking for, or what he left behind. He went down to the storage room. He shone his lamp around, focusing on the walls and the dirt floor. The floor seemed packed down, too firm for simple dirt. He began to chip away at the corner with the pickaxe. The dirt was shallow, only a few inches thick. Beneath it, he struck something hard and cold. Concrete. A rough, uneven slab, clearly poured long after the house was built, sealing off whatever was beneath. Elias spent the next 4 hours in the cramped, airless room, sweat plastering his clothes to his skin despite the cool dampness. The sound of the pickaxe striking the concrete was deafening, a private, frantic noise that he knew was risky, but necessary. He worked on the edges, trying to find a weak point or a seam. Finally, a section of the slab, roughly 4 feet by 3 feet, gave a deep, hollow sound when struck. Using the pickaxe like a lever, Elias managed to wrench the heavy concrete section free. A rank, cold air wafted up, carrying the smell of decay and stagnant water. Beneath the slab was a crude black hole leading to a smaller sub-level chamber. He secured the rope around a sturdy wooden beam in the ceiling and slowly lowered himself down into the darkness. The chamber was small, no more than 6 feet by 6 feet, with a low ceiling. Elias's lamp revealed a stone floor and a single rusted safe set into the wall. It was an old, heavy iron chest, the kind used by banks in the late 19th century, with a complicated multi-dial lock. Beside the safe, however, was something far more disturbing. Wedged into a corner covered partially by damp soil were a few fragments of charred wood and a piece of melted, twisted metal, the remnants of a small, intensive fire. This sub-level was likely beneath the floorboards of the summer cottage Agnes Lincoln supposedly died in, a fire concealed by the accidental blaze. Elias realized that the manor, the mirror, and the family's silence were not about a curse, but a crime. A potential confrontation between Silas Crane and Agnes Lincoln, a conflict over the land or something far more personal, that ended with a staged death and a buried secret. He ran his hand over the top of the safe. It was ice cold. He heard a low, almost imperceptible creak from the passage above him. He froze, instantly silencing his own frantic breathing. The rope swayed slightly. Someone was in the storage room above, and they had just discovered the open hole. Elias was trapped in the dark, damp sublevel, a prisoner of his own frantic search for the truth, and the breathing was loud, rhythmic, and terrifyingly close to the edge of the hole. Elias pressed himself against the cold, damp stone of the sub-level wall, the pickaxe clutched tight in his hand. The safe's cold metal was a grim comfort against his back. The rhythmic breathing from above was now accompanied by the unmistakable, chilling sound of dirt being scraped from the floor of the storage room. The intruder wasn't just looking down. They were cleaning up the evidence of the breach. This was someone meticulous, someone trying to put the lid back on a 17-year-old secret. Elias had to assume the intruder was the man responsible for the psychological attacks, the one who staged the mirror ghost and knew the secret passage. He was being hunted. He waited, heart hammering, trying to make himself as small as possible in the shallow space. He noticed a slight draft. The sub-level chamber had to have another, smaller ventilation shaft leading outside. It was his only chance. He shone his lamp quickly around the edges of the room. Near the base of the wall, behind a pile of old, damp sacks, he found a narrow opening, little more than a foot square, screened by a rusty grill. It was too small to climb through, but it explained the draft. Then the dirt scraping stopped. A low, deliberate voice drifted down the hole. It was a man's voice, raspy and low like sandpaper. "Thorn, you shouldn't have dug." Elias stayed silent. He was not giving away his position or the fact that he was alive and armed. The voice continued, its tone shifting to a chilling, almost paternal disappointment. Clara should have hired a man of less curiosity. The mirror was supposed to be enough. Simple fear keeps men away. But you look for the mechanism, the flaw in the construction. The man knew he was an architect. Aunt Clara must have mentioned it to someone. "The money is no good to you, Thorn," the voice said. "It stays here, like the past." A moment of silence, then a heavy thump as something large was dropped onto the floor above. Elias could hear the scraping sound again, but this time it was different. It sounded like a large, solid object being dragged across the concrete floor. A new, gut-wrenching realization dawned on Elias. The man wasn't just sealing the hole with the concrete slab he had removed. He was covering the entire opening with something heavier, something to silence the hole permanently. Elias frantically began working on the safe. The mechanism was a dial and ring system. Without the combination, it would take days of careful drilling or hours of loud, brute force, neither of which he had. He heard the creak of wood as the man above repositioned something massive. A sound like a muffled sledgehammer blow rattled the earth. The air felt suddenly colder, and the light from his lamp seemed dimmer. He had seconds. He had to assume the safe held the key to Silas Crane's disappearance and Agnes Lincoln's true death. He needed a clue, a piece of leverage. He scrambled to the pile of charred wood. He found a piece about the size of his hand, blackened but still rigid. On its surface, he could faintly make out 3 deep, burnt-in Roman numerals, 9. He stared at the numbers. 9. 9 what? Floors, years, a combination number. Above him, the man began to push the enormous weight over the hole. Elias could hear the stone grating against the concrete. The light from the storage room was rapidly shrinking into a sliver. He had to take a risk. He needed help. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small piece of paint-stained cloth. He ripped off a thin strip and quickly tied it around the piece of charred wood with the Roman numeral 9. Then he hurled the object not up the hole, but through the small, rusty ventilation grill. The package squeezed through the grill with a loud metallic ping, followed by the faint sound of it hitting the damp soil outside. The man above stopped pushing. The light was now gone, and Elias was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The hole was sealed. "You're a fool, Thorn," the voice above said. Closer this time, muffled by the slab, but laced with fury. A dead man, sealed in a vault. The sound of the pickaxe striking the concrete slab confirmed the man was securing the patch job. Elias was buried alive. But the small message, the paint-stained cloth and the numeral 9, was his desperate signal, his only hope. It was a message that, if found, would link the ghostly element of the black paint to the mystery of Agnes Lincoln's fire. He had to survive long enough for someone to find his crude evidence. Elias sat in the cold, thick darkness of the sub-level vault, his hand tracing the rough edges of the old iron safe. The metallic scent was overwhelming now. He was alone with the history of a brutal crime and the terrifying knowledge that the person who sealed the vault would be outside, watching the house, waiting for him to simply vanish. Elias spent the night in the suffocating darkness of the sub-level, the cold dampness seeping into his bones. The air was thin, carrying the heavy scent of rusted iron and dry decay. His mind, the architect's mind, refused to succumb to panic. He focused on the only thing he had, the safe. He estimated its weight to be over 500 pounds. The iron was too thick to cut, and he couldn't make enough noise to draw attention without further enraging the man above. His only option was to find the combination. He knew 3 things. The man was Silas Crane's accomplice or heir. The crime dated to the late 1880s, and the number 9 was a vital clue. Safe combinations of that era were often connected to dates or significant family numbers. Elias began a meticulous search of the small chamber. He ran his hands along the stone walls, searching for any loose mortar or carving. Nothing. He checked the floor again, piece by piece, focusing on the crevices and joints in the flagstones. Finally, in a joint near the base of the safe, his fingers snagged on a loose piece of paper. It was brittle, damp, and tightly folded. He unfolded it under the weak beam of his lamp. It was a section of an old blueprint. The drawing was faded, but recognizable. A technical illustration of the Lincoln Manor's foundation, dating from the house's original construction in 1865. Scribbled in the corner in different ink was a notation, the corner of 3, lot 9, TL, date 9/9/88, TL. Elias knew the initials, Thomas Lincoln, the patriarch, Aunt Clara's father who built the house. The date, September 9th, 1888, was a close match for the date on the photograph of Agnes and Silas Crane. And again, the number 9 appeared 3 times. He looked at the safe. It had 3 dials. 1. First dial, the month. The date was 9/9/88. He started with 9. 2. Second dial, the day. He tried 9 again. 3. Third dial, the year, 88. He knelt before the safe, his fingers slick with sweat. He positioned the first dial on 9, the second dial on 9, the third dial, which was slightly larger and stiffer, on 88. He pulled the heavy brass handle. It was stuck fast. Elias cursed silently. It was too simple. The safe mechanism was a delicate balance of numbers. The architect in him recalled a historical detail. Victorian safes often required the dials to be turned in specific directions and multiples. He looked back at the blueprint scribble. The corner of 3. He tried again, this time using a slightly more complex combination based on the architectural knowledge. 1. Turn left past the first number 3 times, then stop on 9. 2. Turn right past the second number 2 times, then stop on 9. 3. Turn left past the third number once, then stop on 88. He tried the handle. A soft metallic click echoed in the small chamber. The safe door, groaning on ancient hinges, swung open. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed velvet, was a small, ornately carved wooden box. Next to it was a thick, ledger-bound book. Elias reached for the ledger first. The book was a meticulous diary written in Agnes Lincoln's looping, delicate hand. The entries confirmed his fears. Agnes had discovered Silas Crane's plan to illegally divert the town's precious creek water rights away from St. Joseph to a speculative land development, which included a large portion of the Lincoln estate. Agnes had threatened to expose him, using her knowledge of a forged land deed. The entry for September 27, 1888, the date of the photograph, was chilling. Silas knows I have the papers. He says he will pay father, but he won't. I'm taking the true deed to the cottage tonight. If he comes, I will light the lamp by the water and signal the sheriff. The next entry, dated October 1st, 1888, was written in a different hand, stiff, shaky, and masculine. The fool. The fire was clean. The deed is secured. The safe holds the truth now. The mirror will ensure no one disturbs it. No one will look for the crime if they only see the dead. It was the diary of Agnes, concluded by a confession from Thomas Lincoln, the patriarch, Aunt Clara's father, who had covered up the murder for a land deal with Silas Crane, using a controlled fire in the cottage to stage Agnes's death. The real death had occurred right here, in this sub-level vault, and the charred wood was the evidence of the burning of the incriminating documents. Thomas Lincoln created the curse to keep people away from the murder scene. Elias looked at the wooden box. The mirror's terrifying secret was not spectral, but a brutal, paternal betrayal. He carefully opened the small box. Inside, resting on a small leather pouch, was a single silver locket. He opened it. It contained a miniature portrait of a young Agnes Lincoln and a lock of light brown hair. But the leather pouch held the key to his freedom and the key to the crime. A packet of crisp, water-stained documents, the original deed to the Lincoln property, which invalidated Silas Crane's claim, and a smaller, folded document. A handwritten confession from Thomas Lincoln detailing the murder of his daughter Agnes and the payoff from Silas Crane. Elias felt a surge of cold triumph. He had the truth. Now, he had to get out. He heard the faint, distant sound of the persistent rain outside the manor, and he knew his small package, the paint-stained cloth and the numeral 9, must be soaked. But it was his only chance. He gathered the evidence, prepared to wait until the man outside left or the sun rose, giving him a chance to use the ventilation shaft. Elias meticulously organized the contents of the safe: Agnes's diary, the original deed, and Thomas Lincoln's confession. This evidence, a chilling indictment of a patriarch who traded his daughter's life for financial gain, was the real curse of the Lincoln family. He read Thomas Lincoln's confession again. It explained that Silas Crane, enraged by Agnes's possession of the true deed and her threat to expose his water speculation fraud, had come to the manor. Thomas, already deeply indebted to Crane, had agreed to a monstrous compromise. Crane would allow Thomas to keep his share of the land and wipe his debts clean if Thomas would eliminate Agnes and help stage the accident. The mirror's legend was their shared invention, a simple, effective means of psychological deterrence against future heirs. Elias was interrupted by a new sound from above, the muffled ratcheting of metal. The man was working to ensure the concrete slab was perfectly sealed, using some sort of heavy-duty clamp or bolt. The man was not leaving. The claustrophobia began to press in. Elias needed to assess the ventilation shaft again. He returned to the small grill. He could hear the rain clearly now, a sign that the grill opened close to the ground outside. He shoved the pickaxe through the opening. The tool scraped against the outside wall of the foundation, confirming the short distance. He then used the pickaxe to wrench and tear at the rusty grill from the inside, bending the fragile metal until he created a gap just wide enough for him to squeeze a hand through. He then had an idea. He couldn't fit through, but the evidence could. The key was to get it to a trusted person. Elias took a piece of Agnes's diary and scribbled a note. Contact Sheriff's Office, St. Joseph. My location is the sub-level vault beneath Lincoln Manor parlor. Evidence of murder, 1888, is in this document. Seek Dr. Aris Thorne, my cousin, St. Joseph General Hospital. He can verify my identity. He rolled the confession, the deed, the diary, and the note tightly, wrapping them in the oilcloth he'd used to protect his architectural notes. The packet was small enough. He pushed the package through the jagged gap in the grill. It fell a few feet and landed with a wet thud in the mud outside. He couldn't hear the sound of the package, but he saw the faint beam of his lamp reflected in the muddy sheen of the oilcloth just outside the opening. He had done all he could. Now he needed a way out, or a way to survive the siege. Just then, he heard the creak of the mirror door being opened again, far above. The man must have finished securing the sub-level and was returning to the parlor, perhaps to ensure his spectral reflection was in place, or to wait. Elias realized with a sudden chilling certainty the man was not a hired hand or an heir of Silas Crane. The man was Silas Crane himself. The disappearance in 1889 was a lie, another cover-up. Crane had been living in the hidden passages, occasionally maintaining the deception, living off the land and the paranoia he had cultivated. He was old but cunning, protected by the house's isolation and his own manufactured legend. A new sound reached Elias's ears, a soft, careful pounding from the ceiling above the sub-level. The location was precise, right above the sealed hole. Then the low, rasping voice came again, clear but muffled through the thick concrete. I found your little parcel, Thorne. The one you threw out last night. A piece of fabric, a 9. Very clever. Elias's blood ran cold. The man was playing with him. The fabric he had thrown out the night before had been found, rendering his initial signal useless. The wind and the rain brought it to the front porch. I saw your little scribble, the fabric, black paint. You are very good, Thorne. You saw the mechanism. Then the pounding stopped. The sound of metal working began again, closer this time and directly above the safe. The man was drilling. The voice was closer, almost amused now. Your father's brother Thomas, He was a coward. He locked the safe, but not the man. But I am not Thomas. I am locking the man. You won't escape, Thorn. You won't talk. And the mirror will claim you like it claimed Agnes. A simple, forgotten death. A final, terrifying crack of metal echoed from above, followed by a soft, metallic hiss. The man was sealing the inner chamber itself with some form of primitive adhesive or concrete, a double lock to ensure no noise could escape and no help could arrive. Elias was trapped in a coffin of stone and iron, sealed by a madman who had already gotten away with murder for nearly 2 decades and was determined to make Elias the final victim. He had to assume the parcel of evidence he just pushed out was his last hope. The clock was now ticking down to when Silas Crane would realize he'd missed the second, larger package. Elias held his breath, listening to the final muffled sounds of his enemy sealing him into his tomb. The next 2 days blurred into a suffocating, airless hell. Elias rationed the single bottle of water he had brought down, the sound of his own breathing becoming a constant, maddening rhythm. The darkness was absolute. The double lock Silas Crane had rigged above was effective. No sounds from the manor penetrated the vault, and no noises from Elias could escape. His architectural mind, his last refuge, began to fray. He focused on the details of the crime, reciting them like a prayer. Silas Crane, Thomas Lincoln, Agnes, 1888. The true deed. The water rights. He had to stay anchored to the realistic, human facts of the conspiracy, or the psychological pressure would break him. He was sitting against the cold metal of the open safe, the evidence clutched to his chest, when he heard it. A sound that was neither real nor remembered. A faint, mournful singing. It was a woman's voice, high and thin, like a wire drawn too tight, singing an old, mournful hymn that Great-Aunt Clara used to hum. The sound seemed to come from the deepest corner of the vault. Elias shot upright, slamming his head on the low ceiling. He held his breath, straining to hear over the pounding in his ears. The singing stopped. Hysteria. He told himself it was the thin air, the dehydration, the complete lack of external stimulus. He was becoming an unreliable narrator of his own imprisonment. He tried to distract himself, running his hand over the diary and the deed. Then he noticed a detail he had missed in his panicked opening of the safe. On the inside of the safe door, barely visible in the fading light of his lamp, was a small, expertly carved initial. A. Agnes. But beneath the A was something else. A small, almost invisible scratch in the iron, deliberately made. It was a crude, tiny map. The scratch map showed the outline of the manor's foundation and a tiny, almost indecipherable arrow pointing not to the parlor, but towards the western wall, leading out to the overgrown fields. At the terminus of the arrow was a single word, scratched into the iron. Well, Agnes hadn't just used the safe to store the evidence. She had created a last, desperate insurance plan. The safe was her final, silent confession, a message from the grave that was entirely human and physical. Elias now understood his new objective: find the well on the western side of the property. He needed a way to alert whoever might find the evidence to his predicament and the location of Silas Crane's operation. He began crawling, following the draft towards the ventilation grill. The grill was still too small. He picked up his pickaxe. He had to create a noise, a vibration, a disturbance that would carry outside the stone walls, but not be immediately noticed by Silas Crane inside the manor. He began to tap, not hammer, the pickaxe against the loose mortar between the flagstones, creating a rhythm of quiet, insistent clicks. He followed the map in his mind, tapping a sequence that corresponded to the 4 corners of the property, culminating in the western wall. He worked for what felt like an eternity, fueled by the evidence of Agnes's tenacity. Finally, a new sound came, a deep, earth-moving rumble from outside the manor. It was a sound that only a human could make, the heavy grinding of a motor or a large wagon. Then, a sound that made his heart leap. A sharp, distinct rap on the stone wall, directly over the ventilation shaft. One rap. A signal. Elias responded immediately, tapping back with the pickaxe on the flagstone. One rap. A silence followed by 2 fast raps. Elias returned 2 fast raps. He was communicating. But with whom? The sheriff? His cousin Dr. Thorne? Or, in a cruel twist of psychological torment, Silas Crane, who had discovered the second package and was now mocking him. He risked a single, clear whisper at the grill. AGNES. Silence. The outside world went quiet again. The psychological tension was unbearable. Was it help or a trap? Just when his hope began to dissolve back into despair, a faint female voice whispered through the narrow vent, thick with the sound of the rain and the earth. I hear you, Elias. I found the note. You've reached the point of no return. The man who murdered his own daughter to protect a land deal is now sealing Elias in a tomb. Who is this mysterious ally? Keep watching. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the shocking final chapters of the disturbing curse of the Lincoln family mirror. The voice through the vent was salvation, cold and damp, but undeniably real. Elias, however, remained cautious. Silas Crane was a master manipulator. Who are you? Elias whispered back, pressing his mouth against the tiny opening, the stench of rust and mold filling his nostrils. My name is Eleanor. I was Aunt Clara's nurse and confidant. She prepared me. She knew this day would come. Aunt Clara, the recently deceased heir who forced Elias to live in the manor. Eleanor was the unreliable narrator, Clara's ally, who may have been involved in the conspiracy's long-term maintenance or her final desperate solution. The second package. The diary. You have it, Elias pressed. I have it, and I have read it, Eleanor confirmed, her voice now steady, imbued with a chilling calm. Clara told me everything. She spent her life trying to undo her father's crime, but she was too frail. She used the mirror to keep people away, but the curse was a lie. Her only hope was to lure an outsider, an architect, to find the structural secret. Elias realized Clara's condition, the year of residency, was not about securing the house, but about securing his presence long enough to find the hidden vault. Silas Crane is still alive. He sealed me in, Elias stated. He is likely in the house. He is. He has been living in the service passages and the old cellar for years, Eleanor revealed. He is old, Elias, but he is dangerous. He still believes in the power of the fear he created. The well, Elias urged, recalling Agnes's map. Agnes scratched a map on the safe door. It leads to a well on the western wall. What is there? Eleanor hesitated. The well is where Crane accessed the old water pipe network. He diverted the creek using a system built by a corrupt engineer he hired back in '88. The well is also where they disposed of the evidence of Agnes's death. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The true crime scene. You need to get the evidence to the sheriff, Eleanor. The confession, the deed, the diary, then get help. I can't go to the sheriff now, Eleanor said, a trace of real fear in her voice. Crane saw my buggy. He suspects. If I leave, he will know I have the evidence, and he will follow. You and the truth will be silenced forever. Eleanor, a woman in a subordinate position in 1905 society, felt the acute risk of confronting a powerful, maniacal man who had already committed murder. Her fear was a realistic obstacle. What do you propose? Elias demanded, frustration and thin air making him lightheaded. I know the house. I know his routine. I will create a diversion. He is obsessed with the parlor, with the mirror. That is his comfort, his shrine to the lie. You must use the well to escape and meet me. But I'm sealed in. The walls of the sub-level vault are stone, not brick. You are under the parlor's foundation. The well system runs beneath this very room. I will create a loud, distracting disturbance in the main house, a real emergency that forces him to show himself. Elias thought of the old, fragile oil lamps and the tinder-dry wood of the Victorian manor. Don't be a fool, Eleanor. Don't set a fire. Not fire, Elias. Something louder, something structural. Give me 1 hour. When you hear the signal, a repetitive, high-pitched clang, you must use the pickaxe to break through the weakest point in the stone wall, the one closest to the well tunnel. It's marked by a slight discoloration. Agnes left it there. It's the only way out. Eleanor's plan was reckless, but grounded in a knowledge of the house and its secrets. It was a classic gambit. The only way to beat a master manipulator is to force him out of his controlled environment. The discoloration, near the safe? Elias whispered. No, directly opposite the safe. Look for the damp seam. I am going now. Be ready, Elias. The suspense ends tonight. 1 hour. Be ready for the clang. The voice vanished. Elias was alone again, left with Eleanor's chilling words and the immense pressure of the timeline. He moved immediately, his hands shaking, to the wall opposite the safe, feeling along the cold stone for the seam that Agnes Lincoln, nearly 2 decades ago, had deliberately weakened for this exact moment. He had the truth, but freedom and survival now depended on a single, coordinated act of calculated violence against the manor's very structure. The hour that followed was a grinding test of Elias's sanity. The air in the sub-level was growing dangerously thin, and the quiet was a breeding ground for doubt. Had Eleanor been telling the truth, or was she a final, sophisticated trick engineered by Crane? He found the seam. It was a line of crumbling mortar and a slightly darker, water-stained stone, precisely where Eleanor had described. It was a structural weakness, a flaw in the design that Agnes, a meticulous woman betrayed by her own father and a ruthless lawyer, had surely noted. Elias positioned the pickaxe. He focused on the details. The smell of the damp earth outside, the metallic scent of the safe, the cool, smooth surface of Agnes's diary beneath his thumb. These were the anchors to reality. Then the silence was shattered. It wasn't a gunshot or a scream or the sound of fire. It was a deep, resonant clang, followed by another and another, the sound of a massive, heavy object being struck, repetitively and rapidly. It sounded like a bell tower or a steam engine's warning gong, echoing unnaturally throughout the stone foundation. Eleanor was attacking the manor's central load-bearing water tank on the upper floor, using a piece of metal to strike it. The noise was deafening, the vibrations running through the entire structure. It was the perfect diversion, loud, structural, and specifically tied to the water rights fraud that Silas Crane had covered up. "Now!" Elias shouted, the sound swallowed by the reverberating clangs. He swung the pickaxe with all the force his starved body could muster. The first blow struck the seam. Dust and mortar exploded, and a crack snaked across the stone. The second blow hit with a bone-jarring impact. The stone groaned, and a section of the wall shifted inward, revealing a gap of black earth and the damp air of the outside. He heard another sound, faint beneath the din, a high-pitched shriek from the main floor of the manor. Silas Crane was alerted and enraged. Elias attacked the wall with manic energy, widening the hole until he could crawl through. He was no longer an architect. He was a desperate animal fighting for life. He pulled himself through the opening and onto a bed of cold, wet mud. He was in the crawl space between the foundation and the dirt. He oriented himself to the west, towards the well, guided by the continuous clanging from above. He crawled until he saw it, a rough, stone-lined tunnel leading deeper into the earth, just large enough for a man to squeeze through. It smelled strongly of stale, running water, the diverted creek system. As he prepared to enter the tunnel, he heard the sound of heavy footsteps running through the basement above, followed by a fierce, ragged yell. The evidence! Where is the evidence, Eleanor? Silas Crane had abandoned the hunt for Elias and was now confronting Eleanor, who had successfully lured him out of his hiding places and into the open. The clanging stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of a heavy body hitting the floor, a sickening thud. Elias knew he had to move. He had the evidence, and Eleanor had played her part. He dropped into the tunnel. It was cramped and muddy, but offered a clear path. The stone-lined pipe was wide enough for the diverted water flow, making it just large enough for Elias to squeeze through. He crawled for several minutes, the sound of the fight fading behind him, until he saw a circle of faint, sickly daylight ahead. He burst out of the tunnel into a small, ruined pump house, standing over a massive, stone-ringed well. The ground around it was freshly churned mud. He clambered out and collapsed, inhaling the humid, rain-soaked Missouri air. The fresh air was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. He was not alone. Standing near the well, covered in mud and holding a shotgun aimed at the pump house door, was Eleanor. But she wasn't alone either. Standing next to her, bleeding from a cut over his eye, was a man in an old, frayed suit. He was gaunt, his eyes blazing with feral fury. It was the man from the photograph, Silas Crane. Crane lunged, not for Elias, but for Eleanor, his face contorted in a snarl. "You traitorous fool, you sealed your own death." Eleanor, despite her fear, did not flinch. She kept the gun steady. "The mirror lied, Silas. It showed the dead because you put them there. Elias has the truth." Crane paused, his focus switching from Eleanor's gun to Elias. His eyes fell on the oilcloth packet Elias still clutched. The deed. "You found it?" Crane hissed, his old man voice vibrating with manic intensity. "It ends here, Thorne. Like Agnes. Like your father. This land belongs to me." He took one step toward Elias. "It never belonged to you," Elias stated, his voice raw but clear. He tossed the packet of documents into the air. Crane's instinct took over. He lunged, dropping his own hidden knife and grasping for the falling evidence, a frantic, pathetic attempt to bury the crime for good. The moment Crane's attention was fixed on the packet, Eleanor did not fire the shotgun. Instead, she took the opportunity to strike not at Crane, but at the stone pump handle behind him, triggering a final dramatic chain of events. Eleanor didn't fire the shotgun. Instead, she struck the heavy cast-iron pump handle near the well's mouth. The old mechanism, already stressed from years of neglect, fractured with a loud, ringing snap. The sudden breakage caused the pump's heavy flywheel to spin wildly and the main water valve to rupture. A massive pressurized jet of water, diverted from the creek, erupted from the ground, hitting Silas Crane full force as he lunged for the falling packet of evidence. The stream of water, the very resource he had murdered for and schemed to control, knocked the elderly man backward, throwing him off balance and into the open stone-lined well. The documents scattered in the air, falling on the muddy ground, soaked but intact. Elias and Eleanor rushed to the edge. The well was deep, the bottom filled with the churning, muddy water. They saw no sign of Silas Crane. The rushing water had sealed the old lawyer's fate, washing him into the very water system he had illegally created. The truth, in the end, was environmental, not spiritual. The immediate danger was over, but the climax was not complete. Eleanor, trembling, secured the shotgun and began gathering the wet, precious documents. "We have to go to the sheriff now," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "The evidence is here, and your testimony is essential." Eleanor nodded, but her expression was one of profound relief mixed with lingering sorrow. "I know. Clara made me promise. She spent 20 years collecting the small facts that would lead you here. She knew the only way to expose her father's corruption and Silas's greed was to frame it as a ghost story." The true, intricate terror was revealed. The mirror, the sheeted figure, the fear. It was all a brilliant, non-supernatural cover for a decades-old crime, maintained by Clara, who could only fight the powerful corruption of men with the subtle weapon of psychological folklore. Elias and Eleanor rode the muddy buggy into St. Joseph. The local sheriff, a stoic but experienced man named Deputy Cole, was initially skeptical. "The Lincoln Mirror is just an old wives' tale, son. People hear what they want to hear in that house." Elias calmly laid out the soaking wet evidence: the hand-drawn map, the charred wood, the original deed, the diary, and the confession of Thomas Lincoln. Eleanor, supported by Elias, provided her testimony about Clara's final instructions. The evidence was irrefutable. The original deed exposed Silas Crane's colossal fraud involving the town's water supply, a scheme that had been stifling St. Joseph's growth for years. The confession detailed a cold-blooded murder disguised as a domestic accident. Deputy Cole immediately organized a team to search the well and the manor, confirming the existence of the sub-level vault and the crude, desperate seals that had held Elias captive. Weeks later, the Lincoln Manor was sealed off. Elias was declared the rightful owner of the land, now considered an important historical crime scene. He sat in his new, clean apartment in St. Joseph, the heavy heat of summer replaced by the crisp, cool air of early autumn. He looked at his own reflection in the ordinary clean glass of a window pane. He no longer looked tired and severe, he looked haunted, but also resolved. Eleanor had chosen to stay in St. Joseph, working as a volunteer at the local mission. She and Elias now shared a deep, unspoken bond, survivors of a psychological war waged by the dead to protect the living. Elias ultimately kept the Lincoln Manor, not to live in, but to repurpose. He designed a new blueprint for the manor, a historical library and a community center for St. Joseph dedicated to the memory of Agnes Lincoln, the woman who would not let a murder and a corrupt land deal remain buried. The old parlor was the centerpiece. Elias had the Lincoln family mirror restored, but he didn't clean the glass entirely. He left a subtle, permanent layer of grime and distortion in the corners, a constant reminder of the trick. He installed a plaque beneath it. This reflection is a testament to the fact that the only curses that haunt us are the human crimes we refuse to uncover. The curse was broken, not by prayer or magic, but by logic, architecture, and the courage of a young man and a loyal nurse who refused to be scared away by a shadow in the glass. The dead were reflected first because the living, Silas Crane and Thomas Lincoln, had used their memory to shield their crime. The true terror was the greed and betrayal that runs in human blood. Elias Thorne, the architect, had rebuilt the narrative, replacing folklore with the chilling reality of human nature.